Change everything you are and everything you were. Your number's been called. Fights and battles have begun. Revenge will surely come. Your hard times are ahead. Welcome to Preparing for AI.
With me,
Oh yeah, with you
Donald Trump.
and me, Jimmy Rhodes. And this week we are back for the first episode of 2025. So Happy New Year to all of our listeners, if we have any listeners.
If we've got any left, yeah.
Yeah.
The inauguration is in 2 days.
Well, our
Is it not?
inauguration.
My inauguration.
Your inauguration. Oh no, you're Donald Trump, aren't you?
Yeah.
So your inauguration.
My inauguration. So
It's either in 2
I'm
days or minus 4 days, depending on when you're listening to this, because we're in the past.
True.
And
Yeah,
people will
yeah.
listen to this in the future.
The main point is I'm taking time out of my busy schedule to record
this episode. Well, thanks for that. And I guess on that note, I'll let you pick up the reins this week. We're going to do a few sort of short bits of AI news before we launch into part 2 of the episode that we recorded in the future, that we actually recorded about 2 months ago last year with Kristy Loke, just after the election that you won. Or was it before the election you won that you're now being inaugurated for?
I think it was after I won the election, before in between, basically.
Okay. Anyway,
It's
whatever.
quite a big gap.
Yeah,
I've been chomping at the bit
to do this podcast.
to start running the US.
Well, before you run the US, let's talk about some AI stuff.
Yeah. Okay. My forte. So the thing that's sort of popped up recently. So for anyone that doesn't know, Google actually it was Google's research arm that came up with the transformer model, which basically spawned, I don't know, like 6-7 years now of AI research on large language models. And I was watching a really cool documentary the other day, which actually I'm looking at like OpenAI back in 2016, 2017, when they were a fledgling company and no one had heard of them. And a lot of the stuff that happened with transformers kind of happened by accident. So large language models, they were just trying to get models to predict the next token and all the rest of it. And then it was only almost by accident that they realized that they could ask them questions, and then they'd respond with these answers to questions and stuff like that. And from there, like, basically we got to where we are now, where large language models proliferated. They started feeding them huge amounts of data and just kept getting better and better returns. One of the problems with large language models, though, which has become apparent in the last couple of years, is like they're really inefficient with the way their memory works. So even though they, can come up with some pretty good answers to questions, and they're trained on the whole internet, they're actually kind of quite inefficient and using tons and tons of electricity and data, and like these massive data warehouses and all the rest of it.
I don't want to just... Sorry, I say I don't want to interrupt you. I am going to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
So I obviously do want to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking something about the new O3 model, which is the model that doesn't yet exist from OpenAI. And one of the things that I had seen, I'm not sure how true this was. I mean, obviously it's not a model that people can actually use yet, but it was talking about it being currently kind of $10,000 a query was the cost
I've heard the same thing.
of output. And I think that's just something that hasn't been, we talk about like the advance of chips and architecture and how it will get cheaper and cheaper, but actually like some of these absolute frontier models, like it's going to take a hell of a lot to get that down. Even if you get that down, like 10,000 for one query, okay, it's not being used for people to just, ask questions about, random questions on ChatGPT, but like there's just something in there that there is now coming into it as like the use to create these kind of frontier models, in terms of energy use and costs, is potentially like absolutely astronomical.
Yeah, totally. I heard the same thing, like thousands, tens of thousands of dollars per query, and obviously it's just as what's it called, like a technological showcase as opposed to something that we can actually access and use. But going back to what I was talking about, so Google have come up with this new paradigm, this new model, which is called Titans. And another company, I can't actually remember the name, but another company within the same week have released a paper. So these are both scientific papers. And the other one's called Transformers Squared. And what they both seem to be targeting is, instead of just memorizing everything, which is what large language models do right now, is actually better approximating the way human memory works. So actually focusing on what's more relevant. And so what they've developed is this architecture that's kind of models a little bit, looks a bit more like long-term and short-term memory. Obviously, we're not going to go into huge amounts of detail here. If you're really interested, there is actually, I don't always listen to his videos, but there's a video by Matthew Berman that came out explaining Titans, and it's quite a good video. It's quite in depth. But basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to make models that can have massive context windows. So the context window is how long you can have a conversation before basically it loses its memory of that conversation. Have this massive context window whilst also focusing on the pertinent points, so focusing on what's important. And the way they're doing it, as I understand it, is they're trying to introduce something which actually quite a bit more closely approximates the way human memory works, which kind of makes sense because, like, we don't all have eidetic memory where we can remember everything that happened in our lives with perfect recall. And one of the reasons for that is the way that, you know, our brains are quite efficient, and so what they'll do is they'll focus on the key points and focus on the big, like the surprises, that kind of thing. Whereas maybe not focus on the kind of mundane stuff that happens every day, but it's the same all the time. And so that's kind of the way human memory works. As I understand it, that's what this Google paper outlines with a new architecture called Titans. And it's all a drive to make large language models more efficient, not require like $10,000 per query as we sort of evolve into larger models and things like that. So quite interesting stuff.
There's still large language models though, right? This is not a kind of completely new architecture. This is still using transformers, but using it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, so it's a tweak on. I think it's think of it probably as a tweak on transformers themselves. So very similar to the transformer architecture. It is a different architecture, and as I say, Google have called theirs Titans. There's another model name out there that's called Transformers Squared. So they're a different algorithm, a different architecture, so to speak. And I think, as I understand it, it would involve, you know, training models again on this new architecture. However, you know, they're similar to Transformers, I suppose.
I think it segues into the one thing I wanted to talk about, which is a sort of a pretty broad point. I think the trigger for me was there was recently. I'm not sure exactly what it was that they've sort of taken down, but Apple has removed one of its AI features, and it was this kind of news story that it had basically hallucinated, I think was the trigger for it. Yeah. But apparently they'd known about flaws for a while in the way it was operating, and it made me think about sort of some recent experiences that I've had, and I may be
You've been hallucinating again.
Influenced here. I've been on the shrooms again, so there was I mean, I do read quite often the Gary Marcus's Substat letter, and I mean he's pretty far down the rabbit hole the other way on you know how much he thinks large language models are being overhyped. I mean, he doesn't think AI. Eventually, he's worried about safety of AI, but that large language models are just being hyped, and actually they're pretty dumb. And I think, you know, I think there's a lot in what he says. I also think he's possibly, you know, sort of too bought into his own idea. But I do think there's definitely something in my own personal use as well of large language models recently that really sees just a lot of flaws in them. And I appreciate that, you know, even Claude 3.5, you know, GPT-01, they're frontier models, but what we're seeing is not the absolute frontier, right? It's still a publicly facing consumer model, but still it's a frontier model. And the ease of which, you know, you can manipulate the information unintentionally, and the way in which it not necessarily hallucinates, but just, I guess you explained it to me, or you sort of explained this earlier when we were talking about this, in terms of, you know, the way it is just looking for, when you break it down to its most simplest level, it's just looking for the next most likely word. But once you start pushing it in the direction of a particular answer, it gets lost down its own rabbit hole. I mean, I had a conversation with Claude the other day at which it was talking about sort of the biggest existential threats to humanity, and by just carrying out a simple, well, have you thought about this, it convinced itself that the biggest threat to humanity was vaccine hesitation, when, you know, 5 minutes earlier it was 100% sure that climate change was the biggest challenge to humanity. And then it was very easy to push it down the direction of AI being the biggest. And you know, any of these could be. And it's not even the fact that it wasn't able to rethink. So I think in some sense, the fact that it's able to rethink would be a good thing. But it was just like, as soon as you put a suggestion, it's like if you think about how it works, it's like it just gets lost in a different part of its own neural network. Yeah. And I think that's the point is, as long as the information's in there, it then zaps off and it goes to that area. And if you look at, you can actually look on Anthropic's site at kind of a picture of what a large language model neural network looks like. And if you do that, you can almost imagine how it gets stuck in this particular position. But it's not just saying, oh yeah, it's absolutely adamant that this is, I hadn't thought about it that way. Yes, I need to rethink this, but it's just rethinking itself all the time. And it's not rethinking, it's just thinking itself down that rabbit hole. Now, I think the reasoning models are probably slightly better because they do that reasoning step. But I did something similar with ChatGPT. Admittedly, it switched to the cheaper model because it had a subscription halfway through. But it wasn't far off. It was still very easy to kind of manipulate. And then in the same chat, I told it in one chat, I said, forget everything I've said and try and answer this question. Like, just bear in mind the data that you've been trained on. Don't consider our conversation. And it said, even not considering your conversation, I still think this. I then just got out the chat and went into a brand new chat and did the same thing, and it didn't think it at all.
Yeah.
Because the context window again. And I think so. It's really, really worrying actually that, you know, they've not been able to find a way. I know they haven't, the reason they haven't been able to find a way because they don't really understand how it works.
Yeah.
But it does say to me that like there are these limitations. And the Apple example was just that you're seeing now examples of where things are being pulled. Because, and we've talked about this for a long time, about putting models out when they're not ready. There's this kind of race to keep up, race to get products out. It really worries me with agentic models that they're not going to be ready. And so, you know, yes, they're going to be useful, but if you start adopting them too early and they're not limited, you know, the whole thing of like limited single-use models, I can see you can train the model in such a way as probably to get out of this. But once you get into more general things and you look into agentic models, I actually think my concern is like, it's not that this isn't going to work, but it's going to take a bit longer or a lot longer to get to the point where you can really trust it.
Does this not, I mean, just to be clear, so what you're talking about here is like where if you ask a model a question and you do it in a brand new chat, it will basically give you the best answer based on what's on the internet, pretty much. I mean, basically what's on all of its training data, which is everything that's on the internet plus, and then a bit more probably. And so it'll kind of give you a balanced answer, but as soon as you bring something into the conversation, so as soon as you sort of bring, like for example, with your existential threats example, as soon as you mention AI, it then kind of latches onto that because...
Well, actually, I need to rethink this. Actually, I think, yes, you're right, AI is the main threat.
And it can't help it because it's the way large language models are designed to work, and we won't go into loads of detail, but they're predicting the next word. And they're not like as smart as they seem.
Yeah.
They are just
they
predicting.
Appear smarter than they are.
They appear smarter than they are, so they're just predicting the next token. The danger being that people will, when you ask a question, it's very easy to unwittingly, inject some of your own thoughts into that question. So if you ask an open question, that's fine. But if you ask a kind of like leading question with AI, it's going to just like get led down that path very easily. And I think combined with that, I do feel like combined with that is the fact that they kind of aim to please a little bit. Yeah. Like Claude will never be rude to you. It'll never tell you to F off, or it'll tell you that you've upset it and it doesn't want to have a chat with you. I mean, it'll tell you it's got a guardrail sometimes, which is a different thing. But it's never going to get emotional. It's never going to get like, it's never really got an opinion actually. And so if you inadvertently lead it down a path, it's going to kind of follow you down that path and kind of just reinforce what you think already, which is what a lot of the internet is already like, to be honest. So not so much of a departure in a way.
But some of, I've taken when I'm trying to get information now and I really want to know, of going in with almost sort of like double negatives. So asking it, you know, rather than do you think this is a good idea, is like, isn't it an absolutely ridiculous idea that... And then only when it kind of goes against and says, well, no, that you sort of know it's maybe on the right track. I mean, this is just questions. So that, you know, there's a lot of use of large language models, which we said before, you know, things like coding and stuff. This doesn't necessarily affect that. But when I'm talking about agentic models, if you're looking at an agentic model that is managing your inbox, for example, like quite a simple thing, or carrying out tasks, you can think very easily about how by you asking it to do something in a particular way, it will start doing things that you don't necessarily, or you hadn't intended to do. So, again, you're asking a question. You're telling it, oh, you would like it to, you'd like to not have so many emails that do this, and therefore to try and please you, rather than actually, doing what you meant to do. What it ends up doing is just hiding things from you, because that's the path that it's been led down, or it just doesn't, it doesn't. It just tries to find ways. It's not to please you necessarily, but it's more about. It gets pushed down a certain path very quickly, and like I say, the way I see it is almost like fishing in different bits of a lake. You're fishing in bits of the neural network that are the bits that you've pushed it towards, and it can't counter that. It has to do that because of the way that it's built.
Yeah, I agree, and I think agentic stuff, to a certain extent, it's coming anyway, and we'll probably just have to deal with some of this. Like, I've already tried to use it for writing emails and things like that, and it requires a lot of work to rewrite emails. So it's definitely far from ideal in a lot of those kind of things.
It's a timeline thing. I'm not talking about it won't. This idea that it's like it's rubbish, so it won't work. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, like, the timelines. Even if we get agentic stuff, once you push it, you're going to find these flaws, and therefore this kind of ability to completely replace humans. Yeah, I think it gets there, but probably takes longer, because as long as you have even that 0.1% doubt, we can accept 0.1% from humans. We won't accept that much error from a machine. We expect it 100%. And once you see any mistakes, or you see it, doing something, and then find out, well, hang on, it told me this, and then it told me this. It just builds distrust. So it's going to be a big leap. Big leap, I think.
Totally.
I think you had one more thing, didn't you? And then we'll crack on with this interview that we're going to do that we did 2 months ago.
I don't, because I put them both in the first thing. It was the
very clever
Titans and Transformers thing.
Well, that means our listeners won't have to listen to this episode for as long.
Yeah,
so
that's probably good.
Should we do our usual thing? Should we go and, I don't know, make a cup of tea and then do an interview that we did 2 months ago?
Yes.
Welcome to Preparing for AI, the AI podcast for everybody, with your hosts Jimmy Rhodes and me, Matt Cartwright. We explore the human and social impacts of AI, looking at the impact on jobs, AI and sustainability, and most importantly, the urgent need for safe development of AI, governance and alignment.
I think this is a perfect segue into the sort of next question, which is looking at safety development in China. And I think this will be of interest. I think sometimes safety development is not of interest to sort of members of the general public, but I think people who are listening to this will probably, if they're not in China and they don't have a knowledge of China, have at least some level of fear or skepticism around China and what China's doing. So I want to sort of ask you to begin with, I mean, do the leading Chinese companies, do they have safety concerns in the same way as, for example, Anthropic? I mean, are they pursuing AI or AGI or artificial superintelligence, if you like, in a way which is, I don't want to say safe, because it can never be guaranteed, but are they putting safety at the kind of front, or is safety, well, it doesn't matter because actually we just need to catch up with the US?
This is a really interesting area of development, and I think because kind of the starting point for me is I started following these things quite closely 2021 onwards, and the jump, in terms of the growth, the ballooning of interest from the academic and partially from the commercial side in China, when it comes to things like alignment, systemic risk from AI and robustness. Robustness is something that a lot of Chinese companies have invested in for a long time. But it's the alignment conversations that they're having that are really just sort of ballooned after ChatGPT, and especially, I guess, after the global community started coming together and discuss some of these safety concerns, be it extreme risk or something as simple as, this is a governance issue, and we all gotta think about it, both at the international and domestic level. And of course, that culminated in the UK AI Safety Summit as well. So from the Chinese firm side, what I'm interested in is, are the frontier companies, are the companies that are dedicated to building the most advanced AI and pushing the frontier, also investing in tracking the models for, monitoring risk of the model, doing the best practices, putting them in place, being involved in international AI governance discussions. And again, not to keep focusing on Zhipu, but I'm focusing on it because I think it's really interesting. It's one of the signatories of the Seoul AI Summit, where they talk about exactly those points that I just laid out. And at Zhipu, from tracking the interviews with the CEO, they've always been very interested in matching OpenAI's movements, as I was talking about earlier. But one thing that they thought was interesting to replicate or to match is actually the super alignment team, which is no longer there at OpenAI, which is this very ambitious effort led by Elias Suskova to align super intelligence or align very advanced AI. And it's really great, I think, to see this being mentioned at such a level of seriousness at Zhipu and at the CEO level. But what would be interesting to track is if the West or if the US and these leading companies are having that debate or thinking that we got to prioritize certain things and safety is important, but maybe not right now, that will also potentially have an impact on Chinese companies because, as I say, they track Western conversations and actions very closely. And so I think the US really has a chance to lead by example here. And you see Anthropic doing a lot of great work in this sense. So it'd be great to see more of that, and it would be great to see, Chinese companies continue that effort. What is interesting, though, is as more big tech or startups, I think especially the big tech at this point, because it's so expensive to build, is seeing that more of them have the ability to build frontier AI. So if you follow Import AI, Jack Clark's from Anthropic's newsletter, he was reviewing some of the, or looking at some of the models coming out of China, both the Alibaba one and the Tencent open source one. And he said that these are exceptional models and they're getting really close, towards the frontier level. And it seems like the only thing that's missing is really the compute. And so if we're really in this landscape where there's so much capability and competence within China, then it makes sense for the conversations between the US and China to continue, and for us to really take the AI governance issue seriously at a global level, because the technology is proliferating, and Chinese companies are determined. And I think there was quite a bit of a gap in terms of alignment awareness and AI safety awareness back in the days. It's being closed increasingly. There's actually a document from Concordia AI, which is an excellent AI safety consulting and organization in China, that track all the academic and commercial engagement with alignment in terms of archive papers and all that. And they're interested. The important thing is to see that the frontier model companies are also doing the right and doing the relevant research and putting in the guardrails.
We should say on your point about the sort of AI Safety Summit, and on the back of that, the AI Safety Institute, which was established in the UK. I know other countries have kind of done similar, but I know that they have been out to China. They work with counterparts in China that, there are other countries engaged. I think it's obviously more difficult for the US, perhaps. So I don't know to what level of engagement is happening there, but this idea that China is kind of operating as a kind of rogue state in this, well, actually that isn't true. There are concerns, from the Chinese side as well. They don't want this to go completely wrong. Now, I'm not saying how much attention is being paid in terms of the development, but on the sort of governance side and in terms of working together multilaterally and globally, it does seem like there is an appetite there. I just wanted to ask you in terms of the sort of debate on safety. So I feel like, and maybe this is me personally, but I feel like it's not quite, it's not there in the way it was sort of 5-6 months ago, maybe because the whole kind of development at the moment has plateaued a little bit. But there's obviously a big debate in the West around safe development and around the kind of broader and the kind of existential safety debates. Is that happening in China? And if so, to what degree? I've not heard it, and maybe that's the people I hang around with, but I've not heard anybody in China talk about it.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are more debates like at a local level as well that I don't have access to. But to the extent that of things that I have access to, there have been at least 2 forums, 2 panels where Baichuan, all the unicorns, like Gen AI unicorns, and one of them actually included the head of BAI, or the then head of BAI, which is a really important AI research organization in China, based in Beijing. And so what they were talking about is really interesting. I think with the exception of one, the head of 360, which is an international internet security company, a really big one. With the exception of the boss of that, I think everyone else was pretty concerned. They actually debated the accelerationist versus EA positions. And Triple AI's head was talking about how in China there's zhongrong, we're more centrist and we take both sides, and we think both sides are important, but we have a lot of concerns about the wonkier, the more extreme side of the risk as well. And I think this risk cautiousness is seen across the board with Moonshot AI, with Triple. Alibaba, I would love to see a little bit more vocal gesturing from them, but at the same time, they're also doing these kind of alignment research on their end. And so I think they're very risk aware. And one reason to know whether they are is really just understanding that they track Western development very closely. And they also operate in a political environment where the government cares about AI controllability. They wrote it down into their global AI governance initiative, which Xi announced at an international event last October. So that's a side of it. And actually something that I find quite interesting when it comes to studying Chinese governmental engagement with safety, at least on the public front, is how they can manage the goal of making sure that AI is developing safely, but also not dissuading smaller companies or existing companies from innovating and from moving faster. And this is really because, the tech crackdown had an effect on China, and folks, had to adjust to that. And some folks were scared and thought that, there might be interventions and all that. And so it takes time to rebuild that trust, and also it takes time to kind of have that unspoken understanding of each other where, okay, you can go ahead. This is still a priority. Development is still a priority, but please put in the guardrails.
I'm curious. You said everyone in the room apart from the 360 CEO. What did he have to say?
I think he was more along the line of, this is really important geopolitically, and we cannot be left behind, which is true. I think a lot of people feel that way as well. And so development is the ultimate thing. I think a more nuanced response to that we've seen getting really popular in recent months is not developing is the biggest security threat, but development and governance are not direct dichotomies. They're not opposite to each other. You can see this written down, in one of the 2 AI law proposals coming out of China as well. So people are taking it very seriously, kind of the balance between the 2, and definitely not thinking that one means that you don't have to care about the other. And this, again, goes back to the Politburo, the central government announcement from April last year, where they clarified that it's about both. It's not about one. And I think there's some political cost to clarifying that, right? They didn't have to, because clearly China was behind at that point in time, and they still did that. And I think that meant something.
Yeah. The thing I find personally I find most frustrating in this space is like I get the need to be concerned about alignment, but also like with large language models, like the current paradigm, it feels like large language models are plateauing. It feels like they're not gonna. For me, it feels like we're not going to reach AGI just through large language models, and so we're worrying about something that like the current paradigm is probably not going to get us there. Which is you need to be worried about it. It's just that I feel like when we get to AGI, whatever that looks like, and whether it's aligned or not, it's kind of going to be a bit of a surprise attack because we don't really know how we're going to get there right now, and so it's really tricky. Like I know this is like probably a really long question for another podcast.
We do know we're going to get there by 2026 though, because Elon's just told us
2030. Kristy said 2030.
Oh, Kristy, yeah, no,
and I trust Kristy.
I do
more than Elon.
Kristy more than Elon Musk.
But
I quite like Elon Musk.
It feels like a really esoteric thing
trust
where like large language models probably aren't going to get us to this version of AI that's actually going to be really dangerous. And alignment seems to me to be more about guardrails and kind of keeping it in its box rather than some future vision of true like Skynet style AGI and whether that's going to be aligned.
I think part of the alignment question that seems pretty... I think part of the alignment question that seems, or concern that seems pretty solid and kind of like it makes a lot of sense to me is how do you control something effectively when you don't understand the scope of its capabilities and how it gets there? And from what I've seen, I think academically and amongst the leading edge companies in China, they get it, which is important. And it really helps, to have this debate in the open in the West for the Chinese audience to also get on board with it. So yeah, it was good.
That was a fantastic answer, actually. That was a really, really good answer. Yeah.
Before we move on from this section, because I think I wanted to mention something from a paper from Matt Sheehan, who I think you know because I've seen on your LinkedIn account that you are connected. So he wrote he's a great writer on anything China, AI and governance, and I'll link this article in the show notes this week. He did a paper for Carnegie where he basically reverse engineers China's whole AI governance kind of process, and there was one particular bit, so I'm just going to read it. I've just copied down what he wrote. So it's about how algorithms are the point of entry for kind of governance in China. So I'm just going to read this out. So AI governance, this is AI governance in general, this is not just about China, but can utilize different parts of the AI supply chain as a point of entry. Measures can focus on either regulating training data, algorithms, or computing power, otherwise known as compute, or they can simply impose requirements on the final actions taken by an AI product, leaving the remedies up to the developer. China's approach to AI governance has been uniquely focused on algorithms. The choice is clearly displayed in Chinese policy discourse around regulation and the decision to make algorithms the fundamental unit for transparency and disclosure via the algorithm register. Some companies have been forced to complete over 5 separate filings for the same app, each covering a different algorithm used for personalized recommendation, content filtering and more. The structure of the registry and the required disclosure reveals a belief that effective regulation entails an understanding of and potentially an intervention into individual algorithms. China's regulations are not exclusively focused on algorithms. The register also includes requirements to disclose the source of training data. Draft generative AI regulation has specific requirements on the data's diversity and objectivity. Many other requirements, such as that of AI-generated content, reflect socialist core values and are defined based on outcomes rather than technical specifics, where regulators focus their interventions will be an important component of Chinese AI governance going forward. I think this is really important because for those who know very little about Chinese tech, but they know TikTok, or Douyin as it is in China, that dominates because it is so good at the algorithm. China has been better at algorithms for longer, I would say, than anywhere else. Their advances in algorithms, and I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but the algorithm makes sense because of China's social model and the way China is, but also it makes sense because it's a way to control that. So I don't know what came first, but it makes complete sense to me as someone who's been here and has a level of understanding of China that focus on algorithms. But I think it's really important because it is different to how almost anywhere else is looking at governance, certainly in terms of having it's not just part of it, but the majority of the focus is on the algorithm.
Right. I think that's super interesting, and like love Matt's work. We're actually collaborating on a piece that focuses on AI law proposals coming out of China. Hopefully, get it out soon. Yeah, so super interesting, and I think that's absolutely spot on. But that's from maybe a year or two ago. So that's
It
really
is. Yeah,
important, and that's really
yeah, I know.
foundational.
Things have changed since then a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the realization, if we look at, again, the two sets of AI law proposals coming out of China, Chinese experts, people who advise the government, people who work in like leading legal think tanks or organizations, some of them actually are affiliated with CAICT, which is the leading regulatory think tank in China, and the other one, the MIT. So off from reading these proposals, I think the sensor is actually a little bit broader in the sense that compute also matters now. Again, going back to the same thing, and I think Matt really kind of put it really well in I think the same paper, which is China operates where, Chinese governance folks, they operate in a place where they care about the world of ideas. They absorb, hopefully the best ideas from the world. And so in the case of the past year and a bit, compute thresholds has been something top of mind. If you look at the AI executive order coming out of the US in October last year, so the emphasis is on governing, having more oversight, more enhanced oversight on the most powerful AI models. And the way to identify which of the models are the most powerful simply is to look at the training compute size. And I think they defined it at 25 or 24 flop. And one of the Chinese law proposals also kind of took lessons from this and included compute threshold as something that defines whether an AI is high risk. And if you're high risk, then you belong to a category called critical AI. And in that category, you will have to be subjected to more safety reporting. And if within this category, you're actually developing AGI, which is the more advanced AI by the definition, then you actually have to submit yourself to a couple of things, right? Like value alignment and other technical means along those lines. You have to invest in that. And then you also have to do regular safety testing, monitoring for the capabilities and also the risk. Capability is really interesting because that's something that alignment folks care about, right? Capability jumps and all of that. And then the third part is you have to report those results to this designated set of bodies. So I think they're getting really close to what like Western folks care about in the governance space. But this is one of the two sets of proposals, right? The other one tends to have more of a security focus, broader scope of things that are put under governance and regulations. So yeah, there's a debate internally happening in China, but I think both are actually pretty careful in what they're laying out.
Okay, so thinking again about how, China is trying to balance this idea of development versus, to at least some degree, safety. Given its gap, we've acknowledged that there's still a gap in terms of development of frontier AI models with the US. Is safety really important? And I'm looking here not from the point of view, you've talked very well about certain organisations and Zhipu and about their commitment, but from the China as a nation and the Communist Party and the Chinese state. Is it really interested in safe development, or is it purely interested in development as fast as possible?
China needs to give its own name card. It needs to have its own stamp and kind of mark on the international governance scene, in the sense that you got to do governance pretty well at home. And you got to come up with good ideas, share with the world, absorb the great ideas from the rest of the world. Compute threshold might be one of it. Red teaming for models might be one of it. Safety testing, monitoring for, growing capabilities models can be one of it. And also a risk-based framework can be one of it, separating the highest risk AI from the lower risk AI. And this way you can still regulate hard or regulate, the higher risk ones and leave the lower risk one unscathed, from the regulatory hands. And so that's one way to do it. And her phrasing really is, China used to participate in these events. It wants to also shape some of the rules as it participate now. And the way to do it is not to, part of it's just through diplomacy, right? Part of it's also through the agenda of you looking like a responsible AI actor, looking like a responsible AI developer, and also having a good proposal. And the good proposal, I think, that they're considering right now is AI for all. Like the U.S. export controls, from the Chinese point of view, is a tech containment. It is a way to slow down China's tech economic development. That doesn't seem right for them. And so what would seem right is for such an important and powerful and transformative technology to safely get in the hands of more people. And that can mean developing nations, actual, more equal AI distribution. And I think you see that in the Global AI Governance Initiative from Xi in October last year. You also see it in what this AI legal expert is saying in terms of having a name card for China.
What I've just got a question on that. So when you talk about the smaller models and the larger models and where you need to govern and where you don't need to govern, I just wondered what your thoughts are on open source, because a couple of questions, I guess. So first of all, like that threshold, like these open source models, at some point they're going to reach that threshold, and so how do you manage that? Because that's quite difficult, right? If you've got stuff that's just been put out into the public domain, you've got open source algorithms that are really efficient, but also going back to the China element, is China contributing to open source? How much does China use open source models? That's those kind of 2 points really.
Yeah, I think China's been caring about open source software platforms and on all of that, like TensorFlow, tools that are open source. They care about that for quite a while now, and one of the reasons is you can say that this started under Trump, you can say that this predated Trump, but what happened regarding what the U.S. is willing to do in terms of cutting China's access from things that are pretty crucial and that Chinese developers all use is pretty important to its tech development. And so they've been trying to build out their open source ecosystem in various ways since. And I think what the export controls did in the leader's mind, Chinese leader's mind, is that they need to double down on that. And the way to have a say in open source development, the way to benefit from it and not to be cut off entirely from the international linkages, which is really crucial. As we look at the U.S., so many of its talents are foreign-born, right? And so China understands that, and therefore it has this strategic planning from a few years back. And the leading open source models globally right now, quite a bit of them are Chinese. You can look at 01 AI from Kai-Fu Lee again. You can look at Alibaba's QWEN. I never know how to pronounce it. Model.
I call it
It's been doing well for.
I'm corrected if it's QWEN.
It's been doing well for months and consistently. So open source is something that the government is really keen to support on a global and domestic level. I think domestically it perhaps also makes sense because you don't have to build very compute intensive, demanding models from scratch. Again, you can just use a very good open source model from Baichuan, from Ali, and do creative, innovative, value deriving things from it. That's really important. And as I was saying earlier, Chinese government thinks very systematically, especially after the lesson or after many months of reflections upon the export controls. So open source it's to be supported, and you can see it throughout the two AI law proposals as well. The draft, one of the draft is more completely, in support of open source. If you're open source and you're providing it freely and openly, and your code's accessible, then you don't have to answer to legal. You don't have to take on any legal burden. Whereas the other one, the more security conscious, I think, proposal, adds some conditions, right? Like if you have put in necessary safety guardrails when you develop it, you are conscious of the effect that your model will have on the public once it is diffused. then we can lessen your burden or we can remove your burden, which seems pretty sensible to me, right? Like we give you the carrot, but you have to answer to certain things first. But it's hard,
Yeah,
right?
and
It's hard to control something once it's open weight and open code and all that.
yeah, it's fascinating, really. I mean, like, do you think that open source models like Llama 3.2, things like that, I mean, are they being used in China? And then, does that kind of blur the lines in terms of the guardrails and how you put the guardrails on? I mean, obviously you can introduce guardrails to open source models, but there's some. Like, it wasn't even that long ago that Llama 3.2, 350 billion, I think it was more powerful than GPT-4. It's and there's obviously an ever-going arms race, but it was quite impressive at the time.
Yeah, I think this might be an area where it makes sense for global leaders to chat. So it's something that diffuses, right? It's something that Ali develops a model in China, it's used abroad. Same thing with Meta's Llama model. And open source should be encouraged in a lot of ways. I think more and more folks have come to the idea that, of course it makes sense, whether it's from an anti-monopolistic point of view or,
I'm one of those people, Kristy.
right?
I
So I
was
think,
right at the other end, and I've completely changed my position.
yeah, so
I
I
can't
think the
really give me
important
any
thing,
credit for that, though.
I think the important thing here is it's all about balance, and it's not just like no regulation's good. I think here, how do we encourage open source development, but also differentiate between the open weights ones, right? Because if you're open weight, then people can change, you're basically manipulate your model and do things that they want that can be good or bad. And that's one conversation. The other conversation is, if you are a frontier model, if you're a llama, if you're a meta, and should you be subjected to the same regulations as the non-frontier open source models developed by, I don't know, my aunt, my friend, or someone who's much less resourceful, someone whose models will pose much less large-scale risk to the world? I think there should be a sort of differentiation there. Hopefully the discussion is maturing, but yeah, hopefully we'll get there.
So the sort of AI basic law that China is preparing then. So what are the legal voices in China actually proposing, and how does this differ from, for example, the EU's AI Act, or I don't want to use Joe Biden's doomed AI presidential order because I think that's on its way out. But how does it differ, or how will it differ from other examples? The EU one is the one that springs to mind, but if you have better examples to compare it to, then please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the EU one is it's very comprehensive, right? It's a basic law, and the US's approach is more like smaller, nimbler pieces. But yeah, like they're still pretty keen to put some things down and have some sort of governance, which as you kind of mentioned, we'll see how that goes. I'm also anxiously waiting to hear more about that. How it differs. So I think what's interesting is like, what are the similarities, right? I mentioned the compute threshold. I mentioned the awareness of frontier AI, the really advanced ones. You don't have to call them AGI, you can just call them the most advanced AI. They pose a different type and different level of risk than the rest of the models. And I think you see this very clearly in one of the Chinese AI law proposals. Actually, the authors themselves, they say it. One of the lead authors is actually the UN representative, like the high-level advisory representative that I talked about earlier. And they clearly want to gesture at the international community, at policy advisors or policymakers in the West, that China cares about safety and development, and they don't think that it's necessarily in contradiction with each other. And one of the way they do it is, again, focusing and giving enhanced regulation to the frontier AI stuff. So that might mean safety testing and just more oversight in general. So that's one of the proposals. And in addition, they also focus on coordination, right? So different levels of Chinese government, main oversight bodies for AI, from close to the central government to a county level, they should all be able to have oversight over the most advanced AI developers and making sure that they're doing the right thing and have the guardrails in place, including mandating that the most advanced AI have emergency plans. Like if something really bad happened, do they have drills to prepare for that? And how do they perform, reporting to the government for that? So I think that proposal strikes me as Chinese legal scholars really trying to get China closer towards the global gold standard. I mean, there are always folks who think that, globally we're not doing enough, and that's true to a certain extent, right? But just comparing it to the global standard, I think China's definitely meeting it. And then the other proposal coming out of China is actually even more stringent. It's not just adopting this kind of risk-based approach. It's also just saying that foundation model developers, all of you, have to report to us for safety, testing and results. And you have to abide by anti-monopolistic standard, don't abuse your market power. You have to make sure that you are accountable to the public, and so you're transparent with your stuff. So that's much more stringent. And they also ask that less risky AI developers and producers also have to submit a request, submit themselves to a licensing regime before they can develop, before they can publish those products. As long as they meet certain criteria, it will trigger the need for them to enter this regime. So between the two proposals, I think it's, they're pretty concerned, and you can see that on paper. And then in addition, you can also, I think Matt Sheehan also recently wrote a piece on how AI safety's view in China, Chinese view on AI safety is changing quite rapidly on Carnegie's website as well. I think in combination, you're starting to see that all these safety discussions in the West is having a real impact in China. What I find really interesting about the more international facing proposal, the kind of less security focused one, is that they really care to mention how Chinese government and how certain producers need to be regulated in some ways when it comes to AI development that threatens rights or public safety and interest. So one of the things that they put under special application scenarios for oversight is actually judicial AI. So how AI is used in the judicial setting, how state organs might use AI, how social credit systems, will be applied by public organizations. So that's really interesting, and I think that's one way for them to engage with international concerns. And again, building that brand or that image of China being a responsible player. If that's the draft, or that's the proposal that ultimately gains the most traction and influence in China, that'll be really interesting to see.
I don't want this episode to turn into a kind of Matt Sheehan love fest, because we've mentioned him several times, but I do want to reference him again here in the paper that I talked about, which I know is sort of a year or so old, but he does talk there about how actually, the US, I think he's talking about the US in particular, could learn a lot from the way China has regulated. And I think from what you say, a lot of it just sounds actually really sensible, and I think for anybody independently listening to this would probably say that sounds like a far more sensible approach than what is currently coming out of the US. I know obviously in the US there are different reasons, and the kind of shooting down of the kind of California legislation recently was at least partially about the fact that it shouldn't be state-led, it should be something federal, but you don't really have anything there. I think what you've got in China at the moment, and when you compare it to the EU's AI Act as well, it seems far more sensible than what they're doing. I mean, I would say, without being an absolute expert on this, but as someone who has an interest in it, it feels to me that at the moment, China's kind of governance and legislation seems like it's probably the most sensible. Certainly in terms of large countries. Would you
Yeah,
agree?
so I think there are a few caveats, and one of them is that these two proposals, although they're drafted by folks who have been involved in the legislative process before, people who are influential and connected, they're not finalized, right? And although AI law drafting has been put on, has been itemized for like NPC review for 2 years now, it's still taking a little bit of time, and I think the reason here, including for China, including for US, when it comes to hesitance to regulate too harshly, is the geopolitical angle. It's the technological composition framing. And as long as you use this lens, it will influence the legislation. It will make governments a little bit more cautious, unfortunately, and prioritize that sometimes against, safety. Although, that does not seem to be the case in the two proposals, and China could well carve a path that is much more responsible AI driven, but we need to keep watching this essentially. And one thing that I've heard from some of the like legal advisors that I read online is maybe China will ultimately prefer smaller pieces of legislations whilst they continue to work out what they'll do for the basic law. Because if you keep it nimbler, if you just regulate a segment or a particular development, then you can also gain a lot of feedback from the industry, and you can iterate it as the technology, which is quite unpredictable and at times move very fast. Then you can adjust it along the way, and you don't have to have a law that gets outdated. We talk about algorithmic legislation and the emphasis on compute and data, right? That changes all the time because of the needs of the technology changing all the time.
It's one of the biggest challenges for any regulation and governance, isn't it? That you're already, by the sort of nature of that kind of work, you're already behind. And in AI, you're behind by potentially, if you're behind by a year, you're behind by a generation. I think it's the biggest challenge in a sense, like, unless they find a way for the whole way in which governance and regulation works to become more nimble and to become more agile. Maybe they use AI to do that. They're always going to be struggling because of the nature of the work that they do and the nature of the way in which AI is advancing so rapidly. It's like studying AI, isn't it? I talked a few times on the podcast about me personally taking sort of, courses in prompt engineering and being halfway through the course and being like, this is pointless. This is already, when was this? Oh, it was 2 months ago. Oh, there's no point me doing a training from 2 months ago. It's already, what are they working on ChatGPT 3.5? Like, we've already solved this problem.
But yeah, I agree. But then also, is this not why you regulate for outcomes rather than, try to regulate the algorithm? You try to regulate the impact on jobs and how many jobs it can take and what it can say, like the guardrails, this kind of thing, rather than trying to regulate the internals of a large language model.
You're as wise as you are handsome, Jimmy.
No, thank you.
So I think part of the...
Sorry, I'm thinking because... I have to say this, sorry, Kristy. We told listeners that at some point they would get preparing for AI on video and they would get to see Jimmy's perm, and they're going to be incredibly disappointed and think that we lied about his perm. But I have to say, Jimmy did have a perm until yesterday.
Yeah.
Now that we've gone riding forward into the 21st century with video, Jimmy's got rid of his perm. Yeah. So sorry, Kristy, that was I went off on a tangent there.
It's a good one for the loyal listeners. Gotcha. So I think the bottom line, I think, Matt, you talked about this a few times earlier, is understanding that this is a shared problem. And I think what I love, and we talk about like loving Matt Sheehan's work, what I love about the tracing the roots of AI governance in China piece is it's a global ideas, like a global marketplace for ideas. And as a governor, of like AI, you just pick the best ideas and you adapt it to your domestic needs. And, hopefully that's one way to get to a place where there's more consensus across the world. But yeah, like the sheer problem of like, how do you control something that's moving so fast is definitely there. And one of the approach that I don't know if I've touched on yet is China's keen to use existing laws, like be it. There's a piece that I found from one of the legal study organizations in China, is one of the big ones, is looking at the BORT fiasco, like the kind of like the BORT seed issues and within OpenAI, and thinking, is there a way that we can mandate a board that is independent, and how do we do that, and how has the West done it or failed or whatever, and picking up lessons from there, which is really interesting, and that's going to continue.
That's the OpenAI board, wasn't it? I thought.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Should have been.
Should have been.
I think we're heading into the final stretch. I want to give you a bit of an opportunity to maybe talk about something you're working on first, and then to ask you a kind of sort of final couple of questions, sort of more generally about AI. But I know at the moment you're working on understanding China's emerging Chinese AI innovation strategy. So I just wondered, would you like to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so there are lots of literature on Chinese industrial policy for S&T, a lot of great work like Barry Dalton, and I personally really like Yang Yang's work, Professor Yang Yang's work. Lots of great work out there. I think what is interesting to kind of add in this crowded space is, how is this changing, and how is this moving in a slightly or drastically different direction, given the challenges that China is seeing now, today, versus many years ago, when its relationship with the US is just simpler, and when there's no export controls on the most important technology for it to reach the goals that it set for itself. So I think the way to add a little bit more understanding to how the semiconductor side is going to look like is to understand what are the systematic top level, but also bottom level changes that the government's trying to make. And so, yeah, I happened upon this term a while ago, and I kept seeing it. And I think it's just about time to kind of explain what it is. So I'm still in the process of working on this. But what is the new whole of nation system? What is this 新兴举国体制? And what does it indicate for China? Does it mean that it's going to try to acquire technologies at all cost? Or is it trying to develop technologies at a lot of cost? Is it going to take the very fundamental path to innovation, or is it going to take shortcuts? And is it going to, focus on supporting the private sector, or is it going to nationalize a company like Zhipu or Paichuan? So is the state trying to get involved in areas where it shouldn't, or is it actually trying to help in a meaningful way? Has it learned the lessons from projects like the Big Fund when it comes to semiconductor and all that? And it seems like they have. The data are relatively limited, because I think that this strategy started being implemented in earnest, I would say, a little bit before ChatGPT, or a little bit around that time. This is like a work in progress strategy for them. I think they know, because of the technology demands and the nature of the things that they're trying to do, this strategy needs to keep getting updated. And it may not work. It may not work as well as they want, but they want to give it a try. So because it seems quite different from the strategies used before, which, a lot of folks talk about civil military fusion, a lot of folks talk about how state-owned enterprises are leading, there's a lot of leaning on those entities. Those are still important, but that's not necessarily what they're trying to do here. So that seems interesting to me. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll finish off on actually, before I ask this question, I just want to kind of set the scene a little bit. So I first came across you, Kristy. I was studying a governance safety course, and you were not my normal facilitator, but I ended up sitting in on a session that you ran, and I was quite inspired actually by some of the stuff you said in that session. But that particular course, we were looking a lot at kind of existential threats, and the more, because we didn't have time, I guess, to look at everything, we were focused on the bigger and more existential threats. And that was not far off the time when I kind of stared down the bottom of the barrel and and went down my kind of hole of social media and down to the bottom of the rabbit hole. And I think at that point I was firmly in doomer territory. I was definitely, when we did the Utopia Dystopia episode, I was far more inclined to go down the dystopia route. But I think things have changed in the last 6 months, maybe in terms of my own thinking, and I think in terms of actually a lot of people's thinking in where we are. But I would like to ask you your sort of general view on our AI-powered future. Optimist, pessimist, or somewhere in between?
Oh dear.
I should have told you in advance we were going to ask you this question, shouldn't I?
I just hope that I keep this answer short because there's so many angles. There's barely anything that AI doesn't touch, right? I think from the geopolitical side, it's a little bit scary, Like I think the U.S. has done a lot. It could do more when it comes to regulation and governance and all of that. And primarily, I think it's because it can lead by example. And, we need to see more safety conscious and focused firms out there. But at the same time, they operate in an environment that's ultra capitalist. And they need to get the next pot of gold to keep building these super important, super advanced models. And so that's hard. Having spent quite a bit of time in Europe, I think the right path is probably somewhere where capitalism serves the good of humanity and the good of people. But it's really hard, right? How do you have something like that? And so that's just something that I'm a little bit anxious about. But in general, I am also pretty excited to see that more folks, that I know are getting interested in governance, getting interested in AI in general. AI literacy is a big thing, right? Like, how do you have an equaler distribution of AI gains? I think also rest in more folks understanding what it is and caring, using their voice, demanding more safety guardrails, working in the space. So I think I sit firmly in the middle.
Firmly in the
I'm
middle.
also excited for what I can do.
If you're in the middle now, it's an uncomfortable place to be because no one's in the middle these days. It's a very lonely place. So I'll join you in the middle, Kristy.
If you ever listen to our optimist versus
Utopia versus dystopia.
Utopia versus dystopia episodes, I think we decided that to get to the utopia, we need the end of capitalism as it is right now.
I've declared that in several episodes, haven't I?
So yeah, I think we're probably in agreement. Like how does capitalism work in a kind of AI utopia? That's a pretty tricky question. Probably in a very different way at the very, very least.
Not to use too much of a Chinese phrase, but human centricity, right? We're building things that should serve us or should not be against our interests. And that goes pretty deep, right? Goes to a pretty profound level. Joblessness and anxiety around that is one. And yeah, that's so many layers to our relationship with technology. Yeah.
We'll do another 2 hours on that subject in the future, but probably we're in danger of doing another 2 hours right now. So let's stop there, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. That is, we are an hour and sort of 45 minutes in. I think we could have gone a lot more. In my notes and questions that I had, I've skipped over at least 2 sections, but yeah, that is fascinating. I hope that people who are listening, if you've got an interest in China, well, you will have obviously found this interesting. If you hadn't got an interest in China, then at least, if nothing else, I think this will have hopefully opened your eyes to what's happening. I think we mentioned this several times. We're not here to promote China. We're not here to say that China is right or wrong. But what we would like to do is people face things with their eyes open and that they understand what is happening in China through something other than the lens they see in mainstream media. And that nuanced view has some very negative and some very positive aspects to it. But I think in the kind of AI space, it's often portrayed that this is the arms race and, we in the West, which really means the US, need to get there first because US good, China bad. And I think when you look at the kind of more nuanced version of that, but also you look at, how China ties this in, like you said, to its kind of overall strategies, its national security. I think that should give at least some degree of reassurance that, China is thinking about this in the right ways, because it is their national security in the same way as it is everybody else's national security. So it is in their interests for this to happen in a way which, doesn't all go completely wrong.
I think all government. It's. I mean, the things we talked about in the episode today are around what's out in the open in terms of governance. Obviously, all governments are behind the scenes looking to employ AI, probably militarily and all this kind of stuff, which we know nothing about really. And that's a whole different kettle of fish. But I think in terms of what we're talking about today, definitely taking a balanced view on all of this, I think is a very sensible idea. And I think Kristy's definitely given us that.
Thanks for giving me this voice to chat with you guys. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And for anyone listening, if you have a look in the show notes, we will link in sort of Kristy's work and her social media, LinkedIn, etc. So if you want to follow her, find out more about China's AI, then do that. So Kristy, thank you so much. We will make sure that we post you a Preparing for AI hat. It will take a while because we can only afford to ship it via a container ship, but it should get to you some point early next year.
Look forward to that.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Trump builds castles in the cloud. Silicon dreams rising proud. 500 billion for towers of might, while wisdom whispers in the night. Elfman chasing digital gold, while shy read stories centuries old. Silicon dreams in marble halls, while Eastern whispers scale the walls. In this dance of less and more, truth flows through a different door.所的迷雾，神秘打开门，不需华丽的经典，只需精心星球针，30倍的效能流动，原子步伐斗法的创新，回顾梦想赢大地，东方智慧越高强，此舞台上智慧越高强。dream